They said the Titanic was unsinkable, a marvel of human ingenuity, a floating palace so grand, so immense, so invincible, that even nature itself was thought powerless before it. But what if the Titanic that set sail on April 10th, 1912, wasn't the Titanic at all? Some whisper of a conspiracy that lingers even today, that the ship which left Southampton harbor that cold spring morning wasn't the RMS Titanic, but her near-identical sister ship, the Olympic. They claim a terrible insurance scam had been set in motion, that a damaged vessel was disguised under fresh paint and polished brass, and sent across the Atlantic with thousands of unsuspecting souls aboard, doomed before she even left the dock. There are no clear answers, only fragments, only questions that seem to float like mist over the wreck, refusing to settle, refusing to be forgotten. The world remembers the name Titanic, but how much of the truth lies silently in the black cold depths beyond reach, beyond certainty? Yet long before tragedy, before conspiracy, there was a dream, pure and brilliant, born in a time when the world believed there was nothing they could not conquer. The Titanic began not with whispers of betrayal, but with a vision, a dream forged in steel and steam, in ambition and pride. In the early years of the 20th century, the world stood at the edge of a new era. The Industrial Revolution had redrawn the lines of power and possibility. Cities rose higher, factories thundered louder, ships grew larger. Man had bent metal, coal, and steam to his will, and nowhere was this more evident than in the race for supremacy on the Atlantic. The White Star Line, one of the premier shipping companies of the day, sought not to build the fastest ships for speed, had become a dangerous, costly game, but the largest, the most luxurious, the most magnificent vessels to ever grace the seas. Titanic was to be the crown jewel, a floating world unto herself. A statement not merely of wealth, but of the ultimate mastery of human ingenuity. Plans were drawn, rivets hammered, plates bent and sealed. At the Harland and Wolff shipyards in Belfast, Ireland, a giant slowly awakened from the dreams of men. Her frame rose from the waters like the bones of some ancient leviathan. Steel ribs arched skyward. Wooden scaffolds crisscrossed her growing body like veins. For 2 years, thousands of laborers toiled day and night, their hammers clanging in the misty air, their breath clouding in the bitter cold of Northern Ireland. Titanic was a behemoth, 82 feet in length, over 46,000 tons. She dwarfed all who stood before her, a silent, iron god being summoned into existence. Her design was a marvel of both form and function. Watertight compartments, a revolutionary safety feature, were intended to seal off sections of the ship in the event of a breach. She boasted 4 towering funnels, though only 3 were truly necessary. The 4th added purely for aesthetic grandeur. Inside she was a palace. First-class suites rivaled the finest hotels of London and Paris. Dining rooms shimmered with crystal chandeliers. A grand staircase wound its way upward like something out of a fairy tale, its banisters carved with loving precision. For those in third-class, immigrants, dreamers, those chasing a new life across the sea, Titanic still offered comforts unimaginable on other ships. Clean beds, warm meals, electric lighting, every inch of her was designed to impress, to awe, to remind the world that mankind's reach now extended even into the unforgiving oceans. On May 31st, 1911, over 100,000 people crowded the streets of Belfast to witness Titanic's launch. The ship slid into the water with a thunderous roar, the air split by cheers, the ground trembling underfoot. It was as though the earth itself acknowledged the birth of something new, something bigger than all who had dared to dream it. By the time Titanic was fitted, Furnished and ready for her maiden voyage in the spring of 1912, the world was watching with breathless anticipation. Newspapers hailed her as a floating city, a new standard of travel, the safest ship ever built. Passengers gathered their finest clothes, their hopes, their expectations. They spoke of grand adventures, of business deals to be struck, of family reunions waiting on the other side of the ocean. And so, on the morning of April 10th, 1912, beneath a sky veiled in pale clouds, Titanic loomed at the docks of Southampton, her hull gleaming like polished obsidian. Final preparations bustled, porters heaved trunks, families embraced tearfully on the dockside. Excited children clutched toys and waved handkerchiefs from the upper decks. The crew, pristine in their uniforms, lined the rails, a mixture of pride and anxiety etched into their faces. The ship's officers paced the decks, checking and rechecking, for the eyes of the world were upon them. At noon, Titanic's moorings were loosed. Tugboats strained against her massive bulk, guiding her gently into the river test. A new chapter of history had begun, and as Titanic's prow turned toward the wide, waiting Atlantic, none aboard could imagine how short the story would be, or how deeply it would be carved into the memory of the world forever. There is something timeless about the moment when a great ship slips into open water. The bustle and clang of the harbor fall away. The gray banks of the river flatten into the endless horizon, and aboard Titanic a city awoke. The ship's decks stretched seemingly without end beneath the spring sunlight. Passengers lined the rails, waving to the receding English coast, their faces flushed with excitement and adventure. Above them, the great black and buff funnels loomed, sending ghostly ribbons of smoke into the sky. Titanic was not merely a vessel. She was a world divided by invisible borders of class, wealth, and purpose. For those traveling in first class, life aboard was a continuation of life on land, only grander, and perhaps even more splendid. They were the elites of the world. Bankers, politicians, movie stars, industrial titans. Men and women whose names carried weight and whose fortunes built empires. Their suites were breathtaking. The most luxurious accommodations, the parlor suites, were located on B deck and boasted private promenades, multiple bedrooms, gilded fireplaces, and full dining rooms. Each room was decorated in a different style. Georgian, Italian Renaissance, Empire. Silken drapes spilled across wide windows. Rich mahogany and oak lined the walls. Every fixture, every fabric whispered of wealth. The first-class dining saloon was a glittering spectacle, the largest room afloat on any ship at that time. Ornate columns stretched toward the ceilings painted in delicate cream and gold. Tablecloths as white as snow were laid with the finest china, silver cutlery catching the soft electric lights. Meals were grand affairs, multi-course banquets of oysters, roast squab, lamb with mint sauce, and elaborate desserts carried on silver platters. There was a cafe modeled after Parisian promenades, a reading and writing room where ladies gathered to sip tea beneath glowing lamps, and a smoking room where gentlemen reclined in deep leather chairs, cigars glowing softly as the sea rolled beyond the windows. There was even a swimming pool, the first ever on a passenger ship, along with a Turkish bath, complete with hot rooms, cool rooms, massage parlors, and electric baths promising to invigorate the body and soul. First-class passengers strolled the decks, dressed in their finest. Top hats, waistcoats, feathered hats, and long flowing dresses graced the polished floors. They played shuffleboard. They sipped bouillon broth on chilly afternoons. They marveled at the ship's electric elevators, another symbol of a world racing toward the future. Beneath them, in second class, the atmosphere was more modest, but no less remarkable. Second-class passengers were often academics, clergymen, teachers, skilled tradesmen, people of standing and education, if not immense fortune. Their cabins, smaller but comfortable, were still better than first-class accommodations on many older ships. They had their own spacious dining room, their own library, and their own promenade deck, where they could enjoy the sea air without mingling with the first-class elite. Second class had a feeling of hope, of people rising in the world, striving, traveling not just across the ocean, but toward new opportunities. And below them all, farthest down in the ship's belly, was third-class steerage. This was where the dreams were purest and the stakes were highest. The third-class passengers were immigrants from Ireland, from Scandinavia, from Eastern Europe, families with all their worldly belongings packed into battered trunks, young men and women chasing visions of America, the land of streets paved with gold, where fortunes were said to wait for those willing to work hard. Third class aboard Titanic was revolutionary compared to other ships. Unlike the squalid conditions typical of steerage, here the accommodations were clean, well lit and ventilated. Men were housed in large communal rooms, women and children in separate quarters, with bunk beds bolted securely to the walls. Shared dining rooms offered hearty, simple meals: Irish stew, boiled potatoes, bread and butter, cold meat pies. They played music on fiddles and accordions. They danced traditional reels in the evenings, laughter rising up through the decks like the scent of coal smoke and salt air. The ship, though divided by class and status, had a beating heart that pulsed through every rivet and deck plank. The heart of hope. A hope so large, so buoyant, it seemed impossible to imagine that anything could go wrong. The crew, too, lived in their own separate world aboard Titanic. Over 900 officers, stewards, firemen and engineers labored day and night to keep the ship running. In the bowels of the ship, below the waterline, firemen shoveled coal into roaring furnaces, sweat pouring down their soot-streaked faces, lungs raw from the heat and smoke. Stokers fed the Titanic's insatiable boilers, ensuring the great pistons continued to churn the ship forward at a steady 21 knots. Stewards, cooks and maids hurried along service corridors, merely invisible to the passengers they served, part of the vast unseen machinery that kept Titanic moving like clockwork. At the top stood the ship's officers, commanded by Captain Edward John Smith, a seasoned mariner near the end of his illustrious career, whose very presence was meant to reassure passengers that they were in the safest of hands. The days passed aboard Titanic with a serene, dreamlike quality. The sea was unusually calm, like glass, some would later say. The air grew colder as the ship steamed westward, but few paid much mind. They dined, they laughed, they wrote postcards and letters home. They strolled the promenades under the stars. It was a voyage built on confidence, the unshakable belief that in this new century, with its marvelous machines and roaring progress, man had at last tamed the chaos of nature. Titanic sailed onward, a city adrift on an endless sea, unaware that far ahead, waiting silently in the darkness, was a blade of ice, invisible and ancient, that cared nothing for steel or pride or dreams. It was near midnight when Titanic entered the waters of the North Atlantic, deep into the icy expanse known as the Iceberg Alley. The stars above, brighter and more numerous than most had ever seen, shone like diamonds in the endless black canvas of the night sky. Below the deck, the passengers slept. The first-class cabins were quiet, the delicate sounds of laughter and clinking glass now replaced by the stillness of slumber. Second class, too, had quieted, save for the occasional murmur of sleep-tossed travelers. In third class, the sound of distant music still drifted in through the portholes, but even the jolly Irish songs had faded away into dreams. Yet as peaceful as the ship seemed, there was an undercurrent of unease, a sense of impending tension that had nothing to do with the passengers and everything to do with the ship's officers. The temperature had dropped dramatically over the course of the day, plummeting well below freezing, and the lookouts on duty were alert, their eyes scanning the horizon for any sign of danger. The lookout post was manned by Frederick Fleet and his colleague Reginald Lee. They stood at the crow's nest, one of the highest points on the ship, their view of the water interrupted only by the occasional wave cresting in the moonlight. The cold air bit at their faces, their breath visible in the crisp night. There was no sound but the hiss of the ocean against the ship's hull and the occasional creak of the ship's structure. No one knew it then, but there were countless dangerous objects hidden in the blackness ahead. Icebergs drifting silently, waiting in the frozen waters. At approximately 11:40 p.m., Fleet squinted through his binoculars into the night. The sea was calm, a vast expanse of blackness stretched before them, as if the ocean itself had swallowed up every possible sign of life. Then, in the distance, Fleet thought he saw something. It was faint at first, a dark mass on the horizon, rising from the water like a shadow against the moonlight. "Look out! Iceberg right ahead!" Fleet cried, his voice carrying across the quiet night, but by then it was already too late. Reginald Lee rang the warning bell, and Fleet, heart racing, peered harder through his lenses, certain now that it wasn't a mirage or a trick of the light. He could see it, a massive, jagged form, its shape breaking the surface of the water. But even as the warning was raised, Titanic was traveling at a rated speed of 22 knots. Fast, far too fast for the icy waters she was now cutting through. Down in the wheelhouse the officers heard the bell. Captain Smith, a man who had commanded many ships in his time, was already on the bridge. At his side was First Officer William Murdoch, who was at the helm. The orders came swiftly, though none of them were quite fast enough. "Hard a starboard," Murdoch commanded, meaning the wheel should turn fully to the left in an attempt to avoid a collision with the deadly iceberg. The ship lurched, groaning in protest as the massive rudder began to swing. The Titanic was a behemoth. It was built to glide smoothly, and turning such a giant vessel was no easy task. Seconds passed in slow motion. The sound of the ship's engines reverberated through the hull, the hum of the turbines still strong beneath the decks. But the sharp turn was not enough. The ship's hull, designed to be unsinkable, was about to meet the very thing that would prove its downfall. The impact came almost silently at first, a terrible, scraping sound as Titanic's starboard side scraped against the iceberg, the ice tearing into the hull like a giant's fingernails. The iceberg, too, seemed to glide almost effortlessly along Titanic's side, its full, menacing form striking the ship just beneath the waterline. The ship didn't immediately lurch or tilt. There were no screams, not yet, just the sudden and inexplicable noise of ice grinding against steel. Down below in the engine rooms the crew felt the slight, unnatural vibration. The firemen, engineers and stokers used to the rhythmic pounding of the boilers and engines paused for a moment, but the ship didn't feel like it had stopped, and so they resumed their work, unaware of the extent of the damage above. Up on deck, passengers were just beginning to stir. Some heard the strange sound of the collision, but they thought little of it. Others were deep in sleep, their dreams completely unaware of the impending nightmare. But below the surface, inside Titanic's massive hull, the damage was being assessed by the ship's officers and engineers. In the cold and dark, hidden from sight, several compartments had been breached by the iceberg's deadly bite. The ship had been cut open in several places. Water was already beginning to flood the lower levels. It wasn't immediately apparent how catastrophic the damage was, but Titanic had taken the first blow in a war she couldn't win. The water poured into her interior, unseen and unnoticed, slowly creeping toward the engine rooms and boiler rooms. In a world where pride and engineering feats had made men feel invincible, the iceberg had shattered that delusion, and not a single passenger or crew member knew it yet. Titanic continued to glide forward, though her great engines were now silently compromised by the breach. As the ship drifted ever closer to an uncertain fate, the lookout in the crow's nest turned to Lee, his face pale. "Do you think we'll make it?" Fleet asked, though his voice was shaky. Lee said nothing, Neither man had an answer. The iceberg had come, and now all they could do was wait. The first signs of Titanic's true peril came not from the officers, nor the ship's engineers, but from the chilling silence that swept across the decks. As the minutes passed after the collision, the ship did not immediately show the signs of catastrophe. There were no massive lists, no violent tilt, just the calm continuation of a journey that, up until that point, had seemed too perfect to ever go wrong. Up on first-class deck, the rich and powerful, who had been lounging in the grand saloon or enjoying a post-dinner cigar, did not yet know that the very ground beneath their feet was becoming perilous. Most believed that they had merely grazed the iceberg, a minor setback that might have caused little more than a scrape. The orchestra played softly in the background as passengers made their way back to their cabins or strolled across the deck under the sparkling star-filled sky. In fact, many only began to realize the gravity of the situation after Captain Smith received a report from Thomas Andrews, Titanic's chief designer, who had quickly made his way to the damaged compartments. Andrews was horrified by what he saw. The iceberg had inflicted far more damage than anyone had imagined. The ship's watertight compartments, the marvel of Titanic's design intended to save her in case of an accident, were being overwhelmed. The water was rising far more quickly than anyone had anticipated. Andrews immediately understood that Titanic was doomed. There was no way she would stay afloat long enough to reach safety. He made his way to the bridge, his face a mask of grim determination, to deliver the news. Captain Smith, ever calm, took it in without hesitation. He had decades of maritime experience, and now, in this moment of crisis, the ship's reputation and the lives of all aboard fell squarely on his shoulders. "Ladies and gentlemen," Captain Smith addressed the officers, "we must act quickly. The ship is sinking." And so, with that simple statement, the slow realization began to spread. For the passengers, it was still far too early to fully grasp the magnitude of the situation. Many took the announcement with calm disbelief. Some returned to their cabins, expecting the matter to be resolved without further incident. Others stood on deck, staring at the sea, wondering if they were truly in danger. But down below the waterline, chaos had already begun. The flooding was progressing rapidly. The ship's watertight bulkheads, those which were supposed to seal off the lower compartments in the event of an accident, were no match for the volume of water pouring into the vessel. The front of the ship, now compromised, began to settle deeper and deeper into the frigid ocean. In the engine room, the fires that had been burning so brightly only hours earlier began to sputter and die out. Without the force of the boilers, the ship's great engines were powerless, leaving Titanic to drift helplessly toward her fate. It was around 12:25 a.m. Just under an hour after the collision, that the first lifeboats were ordered to be launched. But even as the crew scrambled to prepare the boats, it became painfully clear how inadequate the Titanic was for an emergency of this scale. Titanic had enough lifeboats for only half of the people on board, a fact that had been part of the ship's design philosophy. The designers and the ship's owners had believed that a ship as unsinkable as Titanic would never need lifeboats at all. It was a horrifically misguided assumption, and now, as the ship began to list slowly to one side, the people aboard were about to discover just how fatal that oversight had been. The first lifeboat launched, half filled with passengers and crew, making the journey down to the cold, dark sea below. But the passengers were confused. Some believed they would soon be told that the situation was under control. Others, still unsure of the danger, felt a creeping sense of unease. As the lifeboats continued to be lowered, it became clear that they were not being filled to capacity. There was panic, yes, but there was also disbelief, confusion, and an overwhelming sense of the unknown. The ship was sinking, but how could this be? How could the unsinkable Titanic, this marvel of modern engineering, actually be going down? Meanwhile, the third-class passengers below decks were still unaware of the full extent of the disaster unfolding above them. It was only when water began to pour into the lower levels, flooding corridors, drenching bedding, and turning their world into a nightmarish labyrinth of panic, that they began to realize the truth. Chaos erupted in the corridors of third class. Some rushed toward the upper decks in search of lifeboats. Others, in their panic, pushed and shoved in the darkness, unsure of where they were headed, desperate to escape. But there was no system in place to manage the disaster. The crew, overwhelmed by the scale of the catastrophe, struggled to maintain order. Many of the crew members themselves were not sure where to go or what to do. There were no clear instructions, and as the ship began to tilt more heavily to one side, the access to the lifeboats became more and more restricted. By now, Titanic was sinking at an alarming rate. The bow was low in the water, and the stern began to rise. The grand staircase, once so majestic, now looked like a broken, slanting monument to the ship's slow demise. The steel plates of the ship groaned under the stress, while the freezing cold water surged through the lower decks. The final moments came swiftly, though they seemed to stretch on for an eternity. The last great lurch of Titanic came around 2:20 a.m., when the pressure on her hull reached the breaking point. The ship's stern, now fully raised into the air, split apart. In a final catastrophic gesture, Titanic broke in two, the stern lifting high into the sky before plummeting into the abyss. In the freezing waters of the Atlantic, the last of Titanic's survivors, those still clinging to wreckage or struggling to stay afloat, looked back. The ship that had been a beacon of human achievement, the unsinkable marvel, was gone, swallowed by the sea. The sea was silent, except for the occasional sound of bodies splashing in the freezing water, the desperate cries of survivors drifting in the air, and the faint clatter of lifeboats bobbing on the icy waves. In the hours that followed Titanic's catastrophic sinking, the Atlantic Ocean became a vast, unforgiving graveyard. Survivors clung to whatever debris they could find. Some grabbed onto pieces of the ship's broken railing, others floated helplessly, their limbs numb from the biting cold, their teeth chattering, but none of them could shake the sheer disbelief of what they had just witnessed. The grand, luxurious Titanic, that marvel of the modern world, the unsinkable ship, had sunk to the bottom of the sea, and now they were stranded in the darkness, surrounded by nothing but the merciless chill of the Atlantic. Titanic had gone down in the dead of night, and the freezing temperatures had already taken a heavy toll on those who had survived the wreck. Many, especially those who had been in the water the longest, were now suffering from hypothermia. The cold was so intense that it numbed their limbs, making movement all but impossible. For others, the shock of the cold caused them to pass out quickly, slipping into unconsciousness before the sea could claim them entirely. Some of the lifeboats, though filled with passengers, were dangerously understocked. They were overcrowded. Passengers who had been uncertain, confused, or paralyzed by fear had climbed in, leaving too many behind to perish in the freezing waters. The lifeboats were meant to be safe havens, a means of escape from Titanic's doomed fate, but many were still just as fragile and unprepared for the overwhelming chaos that had erupted. But what was perhaps more disturbing than the cold was the haunting realization that even with all the lifeboats launched, far too many people were still in the water, struggling to stay alive. Titanic's insufficient lifeboat capacity had doomed the lives of hundreds, a tragic flaw that was now painfully evident. There were no clear instructions for boarding the boats, no system for prioritizing who should have been saved first. Many of those in first class had been prioritized over third-class passengers, and the panic had left no room for rational thought. The dark, frigid waters were a landscape of horror. People floated in an agonizing, chilling haze, unsure of how much longer they could survive. The few lifeboats that had managed to escape the wreck were now drifting aimlessly on the open sea, the occupants searching for land that seemed as far away as eternity. In one lifeboat, a group of first-class women and children huddled together, shivering under the thin blankets, their faces pale and drawn with fear. They could see nothing but the impenetrable blackness ahead of them, and though the cold was numbing them, there was still the unbearable weight of grief, disbelief, and terror. One woman, Margaret Brown, known later as the unsinkable Molly Brown, who had been in the lifeboats with others, refused to sit idle. She took charge, rallying the survivors, encouraging them to row to keep moving. She could not let herself surrender to despair, but even with her leadership the night was endless, and no help seemed to be coming. And then, as the hours wore on, the Carpathia appeared on the horizon. At around 4:00 a.m., after what felt like an eternity of floating in the darkness, a distant light began to break through the gloom, a faint flicker at first but soon growing brighter. The Carpathia, a nearby ship that had been in the area when Titanic's distress signals were received, had come to rescue the survivors, though the journey had taken hours. And though they were still miles away, the crew aboard the Carpathia had fought against time and ice to reach Titanic's last known position. The survivors in the lifeboats cried out, their voices hoarse and weak from exhaustion, desperation, and shock. But the crew of the Carpathia had no way of knowing where exactly to find them, so they honned their foghorns in hopes of being heard. One by one, the lifeboats were pulled aboard the Carpathia. Each boat came with its own story, its own terror. Some survivors were in a state of shock, barely able to comprehend the enormity of what had happened. Others clung to one another in silent grief, eyes hollow with loss. The Carpathia crew worked tirelessly, transferring the survivors onto the ship's deck, wrapping them in blankets, offering what little warmth they could. But the horror of Titanic's sinking was still fresh, and even though the survivors were no longer in danger of freezing or sinking with the ship, they had lost something far greater. They had lost loved ones, friends, and a part of themselves that could never be recovered. As the survivors were taken aboard, the Carpathia turned toward New York. The journey, which had once been a dream of grandeur and anticipation, had now turned into a grim march toward survival and eventual mourning. The total number of survivors was heartbreakingly small compared to the thousands who had been aboard Titanic. Only 705 people survived the disaster, a staggering loss of life, and an event that would echo through the years. Those who had survived were left with the unshakable burden of remembering Titanic. The faces of the dead, the screams of the drowning, the coldness of the water that had taken so many of them into its depths, these were memories they would carry with them forever. As the Carpathia made its way to New York, the world was waking up to the news. Titanic's name, which had once symbolized the pinnacle of human achievement, would now be synonymous with catastrophe. Titanic's enduring allure. The rise of Titanic tourism. The disaster of Titanic left an indelible mark on history, but it also planted the seed for an entirely new type of tourism, one that would transcend simple historical remembrance and instead evolve into a deep, almost obsessive fascination with the wreckage of the ship itself. As time passed, the story of Titanic began to transform, not just into a cautionary tale or a tragic piece of history, but into a global phenomenon that would inspire countless exhibitions, museums, documentaries, books, and even Hollywood films. But one of the most striking legacies of Titanic would be the rise of Titanic tourism, an industry that would flourish through the decades and reach its pinnacle in the 21st century. In the early years after the sinking, Titanic was not yet a tourist attraction. The public's focus was understandably on the grief, the loss, and the solemnity of the event. But gradually, as decades passed, the fascination with Titanic's story began to grow, particularly in the 1950s and 1960s, when the focus shifted from mourning the dead to commemorating the ship's grandeur and mystery. By the 1980s, Titanic tourism began to take off in earnest, fueled in part by the increasing public interest in the ship's wreckage, which had remained largely hidden from view since its sinking. Though many of the first attempts to reach the Titanic wreck were unsuccessful, the curiosity surrounding the ship remained. In the 1980s, expeditions by oceanographers, led by people like Robert Ballard, would eventually bring the Titanic wreck into public view, allowing the world to witness it for the first time in over 70 years. With the wreckage now accessible through technology, Titanic tourism reached a new level of intensity. The rise of Titanic-themed attractions and exhibits. As the wreck was finally located in 1985, the Titanic's legacy entered the world of public exhibitions and museums. In cities all over the world, exhibits dedicated to the ill-fated ship began to spring up. These exhibits were often mobile, moving from one city to another, bringing with them pieces of the wreckage, photographs, and artifacts from the ship's voyage. Some of the most iconic pieces displayed were salvaged personal items from passengers, such as jewelry, pocket watches, and even pieces of the ship's interior. These relics were not just artifacts. They were symbols of a world forever lost, of lives that had been tragically cut short in the icy waters of the Atlantic. The Titanic exhibit phenomenon reached its zenith in the 1990s. The Titanic, the artifact exhibition, one of the most famous traveling exhibits, first opened in 1987, and it would go on to tour major cities around the world. The exhibit included remarkable pieces of Titanic's wreckage, as well as mock-ups of the ship's luxurious interior. Visitors could step inside replicas of Titanic's grand staircase, view the famous blueprints of the ship, and even see an actual iceberg wall, creating an immersive experience that made them feel as if they were aboard the doomed vessel. In addition to the exhibits, Titanic-themed tourist attractions began to emerge. In Branson, Missouri, a massive Titanic museum opened in 2006. This museum became one of the most well-known and visited Titanic-themed attractions in the world, drawing in thousands of visitors each year. Visitors could step into recreated cabins from first, second, and third class, see life-sized replicas of the ship's grandeur, and explore the emotional and personal stories of the passengers who had traveled on the ill-fated ship. The Titanic Belfast Museum, which opened in 2012 in Northern Ireland, became another major landmark, built on the site where Titanic was designed and constructed. This museum is dedicated to the history of the ship, its creation, and its eventual demise. It has become one of the most visited tourist destinations in Northern Ireland, with millions of people from all over the world coming to learn more about Titanic's legacy, its tragic end, and its cultural impact. The Titanic wreck site, an underwater pilgrimage. While Titanic-themed attractions on land thrived, another dimension of Titanic tourism took shape, an oceanic one. In the 1990s, as technology advanced, expeditions to the wreck site began. The world's fascination with Titanic's remains shifted from land-based exhibits to the haunting depths where Titanic's wreckage lay 12,500 feet beneath the ocean's surface. The wreck had been located by Robert Ballard in 1985, and by 1987 a few expeditions had already begun to descend into the depths of the Atlantic to observe and document the wreck. The first tourists who were brave enough or wealthy enough to embark on the journey to visit the wreck did so in 1998. Using submersibles, visitors could descend into the cold, dark depths of the ocean, where Titanic lay, almost perfectly preserved in its watery tomb. This kind of expedition was extremely expensive, costing millions of dollars for just a few days of exploration. But that didn't deter wealthy adventurers eager to catch a glimpse of the ship's decayed remains. One of the most notable companies that made Titanic expeditions possible was Blue Marble. Their high-tech submersibles were able to take small groups of paying tourists on expeditions to view Titanic up close. These trips became an exclusive, high-risk adventure, and those lucky enough to participate could see firsthand the awe-inspiring spectacle of Titanic's resting place, the grand staircase covered in barnacles, the broken bow, the collapsed stern. For many, this was the closest they would ever get to the ship itself, and it cemented Titanic's legacy, not just as a symbol of tragedy, but also as a monumental site of historical pilgrimage. However, the environmental concerns surrounding these expeditions became a topic of heated debate. As more and more tourists visited the wreck site, some worried about the preservation of Titanic's delicate state. Titanic's wreckage, fragile and eroding under the pressures of the ocean, had already suffered from decades of decay, and it was feared that the increase in tourism and commercial exploitation would speed up the degradation of the site. Some argued that the wreck should be left undisturbed, to rest in peace, while others saw it as a historical treasure trove that should be explored and studied. Despite these concerns, Titanic tourism continued to grow throughout the 21st century, with more expeditions, exhibits, and even films being made to keep the public's fascination with the doomed ship alive. Titanic's cultural influence, the ship that captured the imagination of the world, from its creation in the early 20th century to its tragic demise on the night of April 15, 1912, the Titanic has become one of the most enduring symbols in modern history. Its story transcends the realm of maritime disaster and has embedded itself deeply into the cultural consciousness across the globe. The cultural influence of Titanic is not just confined to the time immediately following the disaster. It has continued to evolve, taking on different meanings in different eras. From art, music and literature to cinema and even modern-day pop culture, Titanic's presence is ever-pervasive, representing both the best and worst of human nature. Titanic in literature. Even before the ship's final fateful voyage, Titanic had already made its way into the collective imagination through literature. The idea of such a massive, seemingly unsinkable ship, embodying the height of human achievement, was something writers found irresistible. One of the earliest mentions of Titanic in literature came from a novel written by Morgan Robertson in 1898, Futility, or The Wreck of the Titan. In this eerie work of fiction, Robertson, a seasoned sailor, tells the story of a British ship called the Titan, which strikes an iceberg in the North Atlantic and sinks, much like the real Titanic would do 14 years later. What's chilling is that the Titan in Robertson's novel was also described as the largest ship of its time, carrying an insufficient number of lifeboats and sailing through icy waters, eerily similar to the Titanic disaster. After the Titanic tragedy, literature surrounding the ship expanded. Authors from around the world sought to make sense of the catastrophe and to immortalize its victims. For example, Walter Lord's seminal book A Night to Remember, 1955, is often credited with reigniting interest in Titanic in the post-war years. It offered a minute-by-minute account of the events surrounding the sinking, painting vivid portraits of the passengers and crew members who lived and died on that fateful night. Lord's writing contributed to the idea that Titanic was not just a disaster, but a human drama, emphasizing the personal stories of the passengers. This made the tragedy more relatable and humanized the shipwreck, forever changing how the story was perceived. In the years that followed, authors and screenwriters alike continued to draw inspiration from Titanic. Books like Titanic, The Ship of Dreams by Philip Wilkinson and Titanic, Voices from the Disaster by Deborah Hopkinson kept the legacy alive, offering accounts, personal stories, and different perspectives on the event. Even modern literature has referenced Titanic, often as a metaphor for human hubris and the fragility of life. The ship's story continues to resonate because it speaks to universal themes: ambition, human error, love, loss, and the inexorable march of fate. Titanic in film. One of the most defining aspects of Titanic's cultural influence, particularly in the late 20th century, has been its portrayal in film. Perhaps the most famous cinematic representation of Titanic was James Cameron's 1997 film, Titanic. This monumental film became a worldwide sensation, earning a place in cinema history as one of the most successful films of all time, grossing over $2 billion globally. Cameron's film fused historical accuracy with a fictionalized love story, the tragic romance of Jack and Rose, drawing on the deep emotional core of the Titanic disaster to create an iconic piece of cinema that resonated across generations. But Cameron's Titanic was just one chapter in the ship's film legacy. Before the 1997 epic, there had been several films about Titanic. The very first Titanic film, Saved from the Titanic, 1912, was made just weeks after the disaster, starring an actual Titanic survivor, Dorothy Gibson. This movie, though lost to time, marks the beginning of Titanic's representation in cinema as a tragedy. Later adaptations, such as the 1953 film Titanic, took a more dramatized approach, featuring fictionalized accounts of passengers and crew, while still incorporating the key elements of the disaster. Titanic's portrayal in film is not just confined to dramatizations of the sinking. There have been numerous documentaries, including Titanic: The Final Word with James Cameron, 2012, in which the director delves deep into the mysteries of the wreck and presents the most comprehensive study of the disaster yet. In addition to this, the ship's influence is seen in films like A Night to Remember, 1958, which took a more documentary-style approach, focusing on historical accuracy and personal testimonies. The tragic and cinematic nature of Titanic has also made it a favorite subject for fictional treatments in television series, dramas, and even animated features, including animated movies like Titanic: The Legend Goes On, which provides a fantastical retelling of the Titanic story with anthropomorphized characters. Titanic in music. Titanic's influence in the world of music is profound, with the ship and its story inspiring some of the most iconic songs of the 20th century. Perhaps the most famous song associated with the Titanic is My Heart Will Go On, performed by Celine Dion for James Cameron's 1997 film, written by James Horner, Will Jennings, and produced by Walter Arthur C.F. This haunting ballad became synonymous with the film, winning multiple awards including the Academy Award for Best Original Song and the Golden Globe Award. The song's lyrics, paired with the powerful imagery of the film, became a global anthem of love and loss, ensuring Titanic's place in the cultural zeitgeist. But My Heart Will Go On is just one example. There are a number of folk songs, ballads, and compositions that have been written in tribute to the ship. One such song is The Titanic by the famous folk singer Harry Chapin, which explores the emotions surrounding the disaster in a poignant and introspective way. Titanic also inspired musicians across genres, from classical composers who took inspiration from the ship's tragic fate to modern rock bands referencing it in their lyrics. The band The Tragically Hip even recorded a song titled The Titanic, using the ship's story as a metaphor for the end of an era. Titanic in pop culture and the digital age. The Titanic has now taken on a life of its own in modern pop culture, moving beyond just films and music into the digital realm. Video games, graphic novels, and even online communities have contributed to the story's ongoing relevance. In video games, there are various titles inspired by Titanic, ranging from survival games to puzzle adventures, where players are tasked with navigating the doomed ship, experiencing the tragedy from a first-person perspective. The Titanic Adventure Out of Time 1996, for example, is an interactive adventure game that allows players to explore the ship in detail before the crash, uncovering clues and solving mysteries. In the age of social media, Titanic has found a new audience, with fans and historians alike sharing facts, theories, and even fan fiction. Online forums and websites dedicated to Titanic attract millions of views annually, creating a space for people to discuss and reflect on the ship's legacy. The cultural influence of Titanic is far-reaching and ever-evolving, shaping art, literature, film, music, and even digital culture. The tragedy of the ship continues to inspire creative minds, and its story remains a vivid and emotional symbol of human ambition, hubris, and the fragility of life. Titanic's legacy is not merely the ship that sank on a cold night in April 1912. It is a symbol that speaks to the human experience across time and space, connecting us to the past while continually shaping our present and future. Legal reforms. How Titanic changed maritime law forever. The sinking of the Titanic was a wake-up call to the world. The loss of over 1,500 lives, many of whom were among the wealthiest and most influential people of the time, made it clear that the maritime industry had become dangerously complacent. The Titanic was considered a marvel of modern engineering, and yet it sank in less than 3 hours, with an inadequate number of lifeboats and an over-reliance on the ship's supposed invincibility. As the world mourned the tragedy, governments, shipping companies, and international organizations scrambled to address the glaring safety issues revealed by the disaster. The legal reforms that followed would fundamentally alter how ships were designed, operated, and regulated, and they created a new, more rigorous approach to maritime safety that still affects the industry today. The International Convention for the Safety of Life at Sea, SOLAS. The most significant legal reform to come out of the Titanic disaster was the International Convention for the Safety of Life at Sea, or SOLAS, which was established in 1914, just 2 years after the sinking. SOLAS was the result of a series of international meetings and discussions focused on creating laws to prevent such a tragedy from happening again. The convention sought to address the issues surrounding Titanic's design, operation, and safety measures, and its provisions would become the gold standard for maritime safety around the world. One of the most glaring deficiencies in Titanic's safety measures was its inadequate number of lifeboats. The ship only carried enough lifeboats for about half of the passengers and crew on board, which was still compliant with the existing regulations of the time, though it was far from adequate. Under SOLAS, new laws were enacted to ensure that every ship would carry enough lifeboats for every person on board, regardless of class or status. The rules stipulated that lifeboats must be kept in good working order and easily accessible. Lifeboat drills were made mandatory for all passengers and crew, ensuring that everyone on board would know what to do in case of an emergency. Another important reform brought about by SOLAS was the requirement for adequate communication equipment. The Titanic disaster revealed that the ship's Marconi wireless telegraph was insufficient for the amount of communication needed in an emergency. The radio operators aboard Titanic were overwhelmed with the number of distress signals from other ships, and the Marconi equipment was not able to handle the volume of incoming messages. Following the disaster, SOLAS required that all passenger ships be equipped with 24-hour wireless communication capabilities, allowing for constant contact with nearby ships and shore stations. This ensured that in the event of an emergency, help could be summoned quickly and effectively. SOLAS also mandated stricter rules regarding lifeboat drills and the training of crew members. Titanic's crew had not been adequately trained for handling lifeboats and the chaos of a sinking ship. Many lifeboats were launched partially filled, and some were not launched at all because of confusion and disorganization. SOLAS required that all ships have fully trained crews who were familiar with emergency protocols and evacuation procedures. This included regular drills for the crew and passengers, so everyone would know what to do in the event of an emergency, preventing the confusion that led to the tragic loss of life aboard Titanic. The ice patrol and iceberg warnings. One of the major factors contributing to the Titanic disaster was its collision with an iceberg in the North Atlantic. While the ship's design was a marvel of engineering, the fact that it was sailing through an area known for icebergs without adequate precautions raised serious concerns. The Titanic was traveling through a region where icebergs were common, and the ship had been warned multiple times about the presence of ice in its path. However, due to a combination of human error, overconfidence in the ship's design, and a lack of immediate action, the Titanic sailed on without heeding these warnings, ultimately leading to the collision. In response to this, the UN and Canadian governments took action to address the danger posed by icebergs in the Atlantic shipping lanes. In 1914, the International Ice Patrol was created, an organization tasked with monitoring ice conditions in the North Atlantic and providing regular reports to ships in the area. This organization would patrol the sea lanes in real time and issue warnings to all ships operating in the region, allowing captains to make informed decisions about their routes. The Ice Patrol continues to operate today, ensuring that the waters where the Titanic sank remain well monitored and safe for modern vessels. Regulation of ship speed and safety protocols. Another significant legal change brought about by the Titanic disaster was the regulation of ship speed in dangerous waters. At the time of the disaster, Titanic was sailing at near full speed in an area known to have icebergs, despite the warnings, while some ships had already begun reducing speed when they received ice alerts. The Titanic did not slow down. This reckless speed was attributed in part to the ship's designers and the company's desire to make a splash with a new luxury liner. But it became clear after the disaster that better speed regulations were necessary. As part of the aftermath, many countries began imposing speed limits for ships traveling in ice-prone areas. By regulating speed, the hope was that ships would have more time to react if they encountered icebergs or other obstacles in their path. The sinking of the Titanic forced the maritime industry to reconsider how ships were operated, ensuring that caution and safety would take precedence over speed. The impact on insurance and liability laws. The Titanic disaster also had a lasting impact on insurance and liability laws within the maritime industry. In the aftermath, lawsuits were filed by survivors and the families of those who perished. The owners of the Titanic, White Star Line, and other stakeholders found themselves at the center of a legal and financial storm, facing significant public backlash for their failure to provide adequate safety measures. In response to this, liability laws were strengthened, ensuring that shipowners were held accountable for the safety of passengers and crew. Insurance companies also started reassessing how they handled maritime policies, adjusting premiums to account for the greater risks of operating massive passenger ships. This led to a more stringent approach to ship safety and greater transparency in the maritime industry, helping prevent future disasters. The Titanic effect. Shaping future maritime practices. While many of the changes brought about by Titanic were immediate, the long-term effects are just as important. Titanic became a symbol of the need for a more structured and accountable approach to maritime safety. The Titanic effect, as it has sometimes been called, extended far beyond the immediate aftermath of the disaster. It set a precedent for ongoing reforms in the shipping industry, encouraging a culture of safety, accountability, and responsibility that would continue to influence maritime law for decades to come. In the decades following Titanic, maritime laws were updated continuously to ensure that tragedies like the Titanic could never happen again. These reforms laid the groundwork for the shipping industry's modern-day practices, ensuring that ships today are safer, better regulated, and better equipped to handle emergencies. Myths surrounding the Titanic. From the unbelievable to the supernatural. The sinking of the Titanic has inspired a slew of myths and legends, many of which have been passed down through popular culture, newspapers, and word of mouth. Some of these myths are rooted in truth, while others have no factual basis at all. The Titanic tragedy was so dramatic, so full of human error and heroism, that it has attracted its fair share of myths and wild theories, some of which still linger to this day. These myths range from incredible coincidences to supernatural encounters, each one adding another layer to the mystery of the ship and its final moments. The cursed ship, the legend of the Titanic's inescapable fate. One of the most enduring myths surrounding the Titanic is that it was cursed. This theory suggests that the ship's fate was sealed from the very beginning, and that its passengers and crew were doomed to suffer because of some malevolent force. This notion stems, in part, from the fact that some people believed the Titanic was destined to sink because it was so arrogantly touted as unsinkable. But there are also darker elements to this myth. People who claim that the ship was cursed by an angry spirit, or that bad luck was simply unavoidable. There are various claims that a series of eerie omens preceded the disaster. Some passengers reportedly experienced nightmarish premonitions, while others claim to have seen strange figures on board. For example, J. Bruce Ismay, the managing director of the White Star Line, was said to have been haunted by a mysterious figure in the days before the Titanic set sail. Others point to the ship's design. Rumors swirled that the grandiosity and excessiveness of the Titanic were in themselves acts of hubris, and that such pride would inevitably bring about the ship's downfall. The myth of the Titanic as a cursed ship persists to this day, with people suggesting that anyone connected to the ship's creation or voyage was doomed to suffer in some way. The missing ship did a sister ship swap places with the Titanic. Another conspiracy theory, and one that has captured the imaginations of many, is the claim that the Titanic never actually sailed and that a sister ship, the Olympic, was swapped with the Titanic before the voyage. This theory suggests that the real Titanic, which was allegedly damaged in an earlier accident, was secretly replaced with the Olympic, which had a similar appearance and was already in service. The theory goes that the White Star Line, seeking to salvage their reputation and avoid losing such a valuable asset, staged the sinking of the Titanic while the Olympic was switched out and sailed under its name. Proponents of this theory point to supposed inconsistencies in photographs of the ship, such as differences in the portholes and other design elements, claiming that the Titanic seen in the images was actually the Olympic. Some even argue that the Titanic's wreck site contains evidence of a different ship entirely, including peculiar features or damage that are inconsistent with the Titanic's known design. However, there is no credible evidence to support this theory, and experts argue that the Titanic and Olympic were clearly distinguishable, both in terms of their construction and design. The conspiracy persists mainly because of the incredible tragedy of the Titanic sinking, prompting people to search for alternative explanations in the face of such overwhelming loss. The unsinkable myth. Did the Titanic's builders believe it was unstoppable? The idea that the Titanic was considered unsinkable by its builders has been widely circulated, but it's more a myth than a reality. While the Titanic was certainly built with advanced safety features and hailed as the most modern and luxurious ship of its time, it was never actually touted as being completely unsinkable. The myth likely stems from the advertising campaign surrounding the ship, which emphasized its size and technological advancements. In truth, the White Star Line and the ship's builders, including the designer Thomas Andrews, never claimed the Titanic was truly unsinkable. Instead, they believed the ship was unsinkable in the sense that it could withstand the damage of a minor accident, but they never predicted the catastrophic damage caused by the iceberg. In the aftermath of the disaster, however, the media and public began to exaggerate the claims about the ship's supposed invincibility. The myth of the unsinkable Titanic became so pervasive that it continues to haunt the story of the disaster, despite the fact that it was a misconception from the very beginning. The ghost ship, Titanic's last journey, and its haunting. As with many tragedies, the Titanic's final moments have been turned into the stuff of ghost stories. The notion of the Titanic as a ghost ship has captured popular imagination, with tales of the doomed vessel returning from the grave to haunt the waters where it sank. Some claim that on moonlit nights, a shadowy silhouette of the Titanic can be seen cruising along the horizon, forever lost in time. Others speak of eerie sounds, the faint cries of passengers, or the disturbing appearance of ghostly figures on the wreck site. Perhaps the most famous ghost story surrounding the Titanic is the phantom figure of Captain Edward Smith, who is said to appear at the wheel of the ship in the moments before it sinks. According to some accounts, the captain's ghost is seen calmly navigating the ship through the icy waters, even as the disaster unfolds. This eerie vision has been described as a form of cosmic justice, with Captain Smith doomed to repeat his final journey forever. Others believe that the Titanic's first-class passengers, particularly those who perished in the sinking, still roam the deck of the ship's wreck. There have been occasional reports from submarine explorers and deep-sea divers who claim to have seen strange figures in the wreck, or heard unexplainable noises emanating from the ruins of the ship. The Titanic's wreck site itself has become a source of fascination and speculation, with some saying that it's cursed or that the souls of those lost aboard still linger, unable to rest. These ghostly tales have only added to the mystique of the Titanic, blending tragedy and the supernatural into an unsettling narrative that persists in modern folklore. Titanic's final radio message. Did the ship's wireless operator predict its fate? One of the most widely spread myths involves the final radio message sent by Titanic's wireless operator Jack Phillips. According to some accounts, Phillips sent a chilling final message, before the ship sank, "We are sinking fast. There is no chance of getting out. Goodbye, boys. It's been a good trip." However, the actual final messages sent by Phillips were less dramatic, and there's no evidence to suggest that the wireless operator was able to send a last prophetic message. The myth likely comes from a mixture of exaggeration and romanticized retellings of the Titanic's final hours. Phillips was indeed in a state of intense stress during the sinking, but there's no confirmed record of such a poetic last message. It's important to note that many of the wireless operator's messages in the hours leading up to the disaster were not so much focused on the fate of the Titanic, but on relaying distress signals to nearby ships. The Titanic in popular culture, reinforcing myths through film and literature. The enduring myths surrounding the Titanic have been fueled by their portrayal in films, books, and documentaries. The 1997 blockbuster film Titanic, directed by James Cameron, brought many of these myths to the forefront, painting the disaster as a romantic tragedy while simultaneously reinforcing the notion of the ship as a symbol of human hubris. While the film is based on a true historical event, it introduced fictional characters and dramatized certain aspects of the tragedy, blending fact and myth in a way that has helped cement many of the myths surrounding the ship. Similarly, other Titanic-themed films have continued to portray the ship as a place of mystery and tragedy, building upon the myths and legends that have accumulated around it. Technological innovations and historical discoveries linked to the wreck of the Titanic. The wreck of the Titanic, lying some 12,500 feet below the surface of the North Atlantic, has been the focus of technological innovation since its rediscovery in 1985. Over the years, the Titanic wreck site has prompted a series of groundbreaking developments in both underwater exploration and forensic archaeology. These advancements have not only made it possible to study the wreck in greater detail, but have also given us a window into the ship's final moments and the stories of those who perished with it. The discovery of Titanic's wreck, the breakthrough of remote sensing technology. Before the Titanic wreck was discovered, there were numerous attempts to locate the ship, but none were successful. The task seemed nearly impossible due to the depth and scale of the ocean floor, where the Titanic sank. In 1985, a major breakthrough occurred when a team of explorers led by Robert Ballard aboard the research vessel North successfully located the Titanic wreck. They used a combination of sonar technology and remote sensing devices to map the ocean floor in precise detail. Sonar systems, which use sound waves to detect underwater objects, were critical to this discovery. By bouncing sound waves against the ocean floor and measuring the time it took for the waves to return, they were able to create detailed images of the ocean floor's features, including the Titanic. The use of deep-sea submersibles, small, highly specialized submarines designed for deep-water exploration, also played a crucial role. These submersibles allowed researchers to descend to the Titanic's resting place, which was at a depth of around 12,500 feet, 3,800 meters. The use of remote-operated vehicles, ROVs, with cameras allowed them to visually document the wreckage for the first time. The Titanic's rediscovery marked the beginning of an era of intense scientific interest and technological progress in underwater exploration. Submersibles and ROVs, unlocking the Titanic's secrets from the depths. Following the discovery, several missions to the Titanic wreck site have employed submersibles and remotely operated vehicles, ROVs, to explore the shipwreck and gather crucial data. These vehicles are capable of descending to extreme depths, navigating the ocean floor with high precision, and capturing high-definition footage of the wreck. One of the most notable expeditions was conducted by James Cameron, the director of the 1997 film Titanic, who made multiple dives to the wreck in a submersible named the Deep Sea Challenger. His expeditions helped capture some of the most detailed and haunting footage of the wreck, bringing the ship to life in ways that were previously unimaginable. Cameron's dives also helped researchers discover new elements of the wreck site, including previously unseen artifacts and specific damage to the ship's hull that shed light on the events leading up to its sinking. Submersibles like these have also been used to take samples from the wreck and surrounding ocean floor, offering valuable insights into the preservation of the ship and the degradation process due to environmental factors. Some of the data collected during these missions has been vital for understanding the Titanic's decay over time, as well as how best to preserve what remains of the wreck. The use of forensic archaeology, uncovering human stories. While the Titanic's wreck site has long been a focal point for exploring the ship itself, it has also become a site of forensic archaeology, with a focus on recovering artifacts that help tell the story of the people who lived and died aboard the ship. In the years since the wreck's discovery, countless artifacts have been recovered from the ocean floor, including personal items like jewelry, clothing, and silverware, each one offering a tangible connection to the past. These items have provided crucial insights into the lives of the Titanic's passengers and crew, adding a personal human element to the disaster. Forensic scientists and archaeologists have carefully studied these objects to piece together the ship's final moments. For example, the examination of human remains found in the wreckage has helped researchers understand the conditions aboard the Titanic during its last hours. Clothing samples found in the wreck have been analyzed for evidence of hypothermia and other conditions that contributed to the passengers' and crew's deaths. The physical evidence uncovered has also given us a better understanding of how the Titanic's passengers interacted with the ship and each other during the chaos of the sinking. The use of forensic methods has been particularly instrumental in studying the human toll of the disaster, shedding light on the final moments of those trapped aboard the ship and the panic that ensued. By understanding the forensic evidence and archaeological context of the wreck, historians and scientists have been able to tell a fuller, more comprehensive story of the Titanic's sinking and the lives lost. Titanic's impact on ship safety. The genesis of modern maritime laws. The sinking of the Titanic led to significant changes in maritime safety regulations. One of the most important technological innovations resulting from the disaster was the introduction of lifeboat regulations. Prior to the Titanic, ships were only required to carry lifeboats for a small percentage of the passengers and crew. The Titanic, for example, was only equipped with lifeboats for about half of those on board. After the disaster, new regulations were put into place requiring that all ships be equipped with enough lifeboats to accommodate every person aboard. The International Convention for the Safety of Life at Sea, SOLAS, was established in 1914, a year after the Titanic's sinking, and it set comprehensive safety standards for ships, including requirements for lifeboats, life vests, and other safety equipment. SOLAS also implemented changes to iceberg warning systems, requiring ships to pay closer attention to ice conditions and report them to others in the area. These regulatory changes were critical in ensuring that tragedies like the Titanic's sinking would not be repeated. Additionally, the Titanic disaster led to advancements in radio communication technology. The Titanic's wireless operators, who sent distress signals in the hours before the ship sank, demonstrated the power and importance of long-range wireless communication. In response, the use of wireless telegraphy was expanded, and it became a requirement for all passenger ships to be equipped with wireless radios capable of transmitting distress signals. This was a crucial step toward improving communication between ships at sea and ensuring that future emergencies could be more effectively managed. The Titanic wreck, decay, and preservation. Over the years, the Titanic wreck has been deteriorating at a rapid pace. The cold, deep waters of the Atlantic have created a hostile environment for the preservation of the ship, and the wreck is slowly being consumed by the ocean. Scientists have used advanced imaging technology, including 3D sonar scanning, to map and study the wreck site. These scans help provide a detailed and accurate record of the ship's condition and track its rate of decay. One of the most important discoveries was the rusticles, a phenomenon where iron-eating bacteria consume the ship's hull, producing rust formations that resemble icicles. These rusticles have contributed to the degradation of the ship's structure and pose a serious threat to its long-term survival. The deterioration of the Titanic has sparked debates about preserving the site. Some scientists argue that the wreck should be left undisturbed as a historical monument, while others suggest that more should be done to conserve what remains of the ship for future generations. A final thought: Titanic's legacy in technology. The Titanic's story, from its creation to its tragic sinking, has left an indelible mark on both history and technology. The advancements in underwater exploration and forensic archaeology, driven by the need to understand the wreck, have not only revealed new insights into the disaster, but have also paved the way for new technologies that benefit humanity today. The Titanic has become a symbol of human ambition and the fragility of life, with its wreck site serving as a constant reminder of the forces of nature and human fallibility. The technological innovations it inspired will continue to shape the future of exploration, safety, and historical preservation for generations to come. The Titanic, once celebrated as the largest and most luxurious ship in the world, has left a legacy that transcends its tragic sinking. The disaster, occurring on the night of April 15, 1912, revealed the stark realities of human error and hubris. But it also sparked profound changes in maritime safety regulations, advanced underwater exploration technology, and inspired cultural myths that continue to captivate the world. From the conspiracy theories surrounding its construction and the idea that a different ship may have sailed in its place, to the forensic archaeology that uncovered personal artifacts from the wreck, each chapter of Titanic's story reveals new layers of intrigue. The wreck itself, discovered in 1985, became a hub for technological advances, pioneering submersible dives, sonar scanning, and the exploration of a world deep beneath the ocean's surface. The aftermath of the Titanic disaster also led to legislative reforms in ship safety, with the introduction of lifeboat requirements and new communication protocols that ultimately made travel by sea much safer. The wreck continues to deteriorate, but the lessons learned from Titanic's final voyage have become a touchstone for both maritime history and the human spirit. The Titanic's tragic end is a poignant reminder of the fragility of life, the cost of human ambition, and the unpredictable nature of fate. Despite the ruin, the ship's cultural impact endures, woven into films, books, and myths. Through technology, we've come to understand not just the tragedy, but the vessel itself, an artifact of history whose memory continues to evolve. As we remember the Titanic, it's more than a disaster, it's a symbol of advancement, loss, and legacy. The wreck lies silent beneath the waves, but the lessons it holds, the stories it tells, and the mysteries it still guards will keep it alive in the minds and hearts of people across the world for generations to come. And so the Titanic sails on, not on the waves of the ocean, but through the currents of time, both as a testament to human achievement and a warning of its limits. The ship may have sunk that fateful night, but in our quest for knowledge, we have resurrected it from the depths, ensuring its place in history forever. The Titanic is gone, but its story, as haunting and captivating as the ocean itself, will never be forgotten.